Hello, everyone. I am Frank Place, Director of the CGIAR Research Program on Policies, Institutions, and Markets, or PIM for short, and I am very happy to welcome you to the PIM webinar on land tenure and perceived tenure security in the era of social and economic transformation in Africa. This work is part of the PIM portfolio under our research flagship 5 on governance of natural resources. Our speaker today is Hosanna Gebru. He's a research fellow at the Development and Governance Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute. Now, he normally is based in Addis Ababa, but we're very happy to have him here in Washington today for the webinar. Dr. Gebru undertakes applied microeconomics research with a focus on property rights, land markets, and investment incentives. He also specializes in gender disaggregated impact evaluations of various land policy and governance reforms, assessing how those influence agricultural productivity and contribute to sustainable land management and intra-household welfare and bargaining power in a variety of African countries, including Nigeria, Mozambique, Ghana, Ethiopia, and Uganda. And Hosanna also coordinates a project that we call Monitoring and Evaluation of Land Governance in Africa, or MELA, which is a pilot initiative designed to track progress and implementation of the African Union's Declaration on Land Issues and Challenges, and that's taking place in 10 countries in Africa. Now, before I hand it over to Hosanna, let me remind everyone how we proceed with the webinar and our rules of the game. So our speaker will begin shortly with a presentation that you will see on your screens, and that presentation will last for about 30 minutes. During the presentation, we invite all of you to send in questions via the chat window on the right side of your screens. We will collate the questions and group any that are similar in content. Once we are in the Q&A session, our speaker will address the questions as we pose them to you on your behalf. We handle it this way to make the best use of our 1 hour together. Just as a reminder, we are recording the webinar and we'll make it available on our website shortly after the live event. And with that, I will hand it over to Hosanna. Welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Not sure if I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, but hello, everyone. So before I start my presentation, I would like to make a comment on this is not like a single study that I'm going to present, but it is more of a synthesis of the various findings from case studies from selected African countries. And the motivation so the motivation for this the motivation for this is that over the course of the last decade or so, there has been a growing scrutiny on the customary tenure system in terms of whether it's sufficient to safeguard land rights of especially vulnerable groups like women and smallholder farmers, and rightly so, many African countries undertook land tenure programs to again enhance good land governance, either by improving land administration systems or enhancing taking actions, policy actions to increase tenure security. But again, this was with mixed results. One, in terms of the potential economic and social outcomes of these land right protection programs. And what we see from various countries is also like the very low uptake of such kind of programs, especially what we call the land titling or registration and certification programs. And the other issue that has been subject of these reforms that has been happening in Africa is also the sustainability issues. And I will, over the course of the next few minutes, I'll try to touch those various dimensions of land governance issues in the continent. And again, even though there was a consensus in terms of the need to enhance tenure security and to address the scrutiny of the customary tenure system, but there remains to be a knowledge gap in terms of like how do we measure tenure security before we even attempt to address or to come up with policy prescriptions to address tenure security issues, and also how do we, what level of disaggregation is deemed sufficient to protect land rights of the various vulnerable groups, especially the intra-household dimensions. And again, what we see mainly associated with land rights protection or good land governance is formalization of individual land rights has long been seen as kind of the silver bullet to address issues of tenure insecurity. But again, as I mentioned earlier, there remains to be a huge knowledge gap in terms of like who are we trying to address the issues of tenure insecurity, and at what level would that be considered sufficient to enhance tenure security. And many African countries, as I mentioned earlier, there is no lack of attempt to address tenure insecurity, but again, the issue remains to be in terms of like how do we make it sustainable and the equity dimensions of these programs. So the webinar, I will try over the course of the next few minutes, I'll try to again address the knowledge gap by assessing the potential regulatory and institutional challenges in maintaining good land governance in Africa, and I will try to draw on results from a diagnostic tool developed by the World Bank, the Land Governance Assessment Framework, just to give a snapshot of like what is at stake and what's the status quo in terms of the regulatory and institutional issues in the continent. And also I'll try to use draw on household surveys that the last few years over the course of the last decade. What we have is like we are trying to get to fill the data gap in terms of addressing issues of tenure security, the gender dimensions of this, and I'll try to use again data from 4 African countries to investigate the drivers of tenure insecurity, and mainly looking at what the implications of the social and economic dynamics, and I will try to explain what I meant by the social and economic dynamics and their implications on tenure security. So the first, like I try to group the presentations first. Again, just taking advantage of this diagnostic tool, I'll try to present the status quo or the situations in terms of the regulatory and institutional frameworks in the continent. Later on, I will again use the case studies from the 4 African countries, but again, I will take advantage of a very unique data set that we have collected from Mozambique in terms of like looking at the intra and inter-household dimensions of tenure security. So first, again, I don't know, maybe I should say a few words what the land governance assessment framework is, and that is a diagnostic land governance tool developed by the World Bank to examine challenges in the implementation and enforcement of legal and institutional frameworks globally. And again, under the, again, this is like based on secondary available data or expert opinions, and the next few slides would use color coded, and that is A represents again favorable land governance situation in a given country, and D is the most unfavorable land governance situations, and whatever happens in between will show the stats. So the first thing is, okay, let's again, the recognition of land rights. What's the current status of the recognition of land rights? What are the implementation issues, and what about the accessibility and sustainability? So when we look at the recognition of land rights, especially vulnerable groups like women, so this is again a subset of the land governance assessment framework indicators. This is not like the comprehensive results of the LGAF, but I try to pick parameters that I feel will fit the issue that we are discussing right now. So in terms of recognition of land rights, if we look at the first parameter and the second from the last parameter, that is women property rights in land, for instance, as recognized by the relevant laws and are recorded. So what we see is, with the exception of Ethiopia and Rwanda, the situation in terms of women land rights protection is not something that the continent can be again feel very proud. And again, the other parameter that I want to pick in terms of the recognition of land rights is how non-documented evidences is effectively used to help establish or claim land rights. And again, what we see is, with the exception of Ethiopia, Rwanda, Uganda, and Zambia, the other countries seems to struggle even with the parameter that especially targets the most vulnerable groups like smallholders and women. Okay, in terms of since we have seen already in terms of the recognition of land rights, how about the enforcement and implementation issues? And again, I would like to pick 3 parameters from the LGAF indicators. That is the first, the third, and the last indicators in the second table that shows the LGAF results. So the first is like, to what extent are the formal payments to document land rights prohibitively very high to exclude again those vulnerable groups like women and smallholder farmers in Africa. And what we see is, again, with the exception of Ethiopia, the issue of like high cost of land rights registration and documentation seems to be again an issue with the remaining 10 countries. Needless to mention the names of these 10 countries as it is very clearly represented. So even if there is again issues with the cost of again this the pragmatic way of land rights registration in the continent, I also try to pick on like how about the informal payments, the bribes, and corruption issues. And the third parameter is, are informal payments discouraged? And again, what we see is, again, with the exception of Rwanda, that remains to be, especially in Ethiopia, Ghana, and Madagascar, that the informal payments and issues of corruption seems to be again unfavorably discriminating those vulnerable groups. And the last is, how about again, with implications on the customary tenure system in traditional way of land governance, are there accessible, I mean, the appealing land dispute resolution mechanisms, are they accessible, affordable, and timely and process of appealing these disputes? What we see is, with the exception of Ghana and Rwanda, that remains to be again one of the challenges of maintaining good land governance in the continent. And the last kind of dimension that I would like to consider here is, how about the land service delivery systems? Are they accessible and sustainable? And as I mentioned in the first few slides, the issue, I mean, what we have seen over the last few years in Africa is not the lack of countries or governments trying to do something to improve land governance, but it is the issue of the sustainability of these programs, because some of these programs are hugely funded by donor funds, and the moment the donor fund is withdrawn, what we see, what was considered as the best tool to enhance land governance, starting to fall apart. So, and again, with this third dimension, I would love to take the audience to have a closer look at the second and third parameters. That is, at the implementation of land policies costed matched with benefits and adequately resourced locally. So this is our government's, again, whether it's land titling program, whether it's administrative reforms, are they locally resourced? And because this has a huge implication on the sustainability of these programs. And again, Madagascar and Rwanda, with the exception of Madagascar and Rwanda, the remaining 8 countries seems to again struggle with these dimensions of one indicator on showing the good land governance, and especially with the particular relevance to what IFPRI has been trying to do with the African Land Policy Center. We also try to look at how these programs are regularly monitored, and whether there is a regular monitoring and reporting systems. And again, this is also one dimension that we don't see many of the countries performing really well. So after looking at this kind of the status quo, what the status quo shows in terms of good land governance or maintaining good land governance in the continent, as I mentioned earlier, we also try to use household surveys that are very good in land right issues, land tenure issues, and this we try to use data sets from I should say mainly Ethiopia, Ghana, Mozambique, and Nigeria. These 4 countries. We also try to do similar analysis with Malawi, but there is some data gap that we're trying to deal with. So I will, over the course of the next few slides, I will present results from Ethiopia, Ghana, Mozambique, and Nigeria, and these are like kind of nationally representative surveys that we feel are good enough to have a go in terms of understanding what are the driving factors in understanding the perceived tenure security of households. So first, when we look at the patterns in terms of tenure insecurity, again, in Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Tanzania, what we see is an increasing trend in the level of perceived tenure security. And again, later on, I'll try to disaggregate even what we mean by perceived tenure security. That is private tenure risk versus public tenure risk. But this is whether if households report that they fear losing the land because of expropriation or even because of individual disputes, we consider it as a kind of a binary variable. And what we see is not only is the level of perceived tenure security insecurity considerably high, but what we see in those three countries, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Tanzania, kind of growing trend. As I mentioned earlier, we also try to disaggregate whether the perceived tenure risk is more of like a collective tenure risk. We call it collective tenure risk if it is households reported that they fear losing the land because of eviction by private investor or expropriation by the government. This is how we define collective tenure risk. Whether the other one is private tenure risk is if households' source of tenure insecurity is associated with kind of private tenure risk, that is whether it's a dispute, inheritance, divorce, all these kind of things, we group them as private tenure risk. And what is interesting in this slide that shows the source of tenure insecurity is that in the case of Mozambique, in Nigeria and Ethiopia, predominantly the private tenure risk seems to be the predominant source of tenure insecurity. But in Mozambique, it's not only that private tenure risk is relatively lower as compared to the other countries, but we see again the proportion, the very source of tenure insecurity seems to be fear of losing land due to government expropriation or eviction by private investors. And I think the audience may associate this. Again, Mozambique has been the target of the large-scale land-based investments, and it's not surprising to see that the story is flipped in the case of Mozambique compared to Nigeria and Ethiopia. So, and as I mentioned earlier, we also tried to, okay, if once we see that the relatively high proportion of households and increasing trend in proportion of tenure insecurity, we also try to look at what could be the driving sources. And again, even if there is a growing kind of consensus that there is scrutiny under the customary tenure system, there was no evidence in terms of what the social and economic dynamics are having an impact on the protection the customary tenure system used to give to smallholders and women and other vulnerable groups. So we tried to generate some cluster level indicators to proxy. For instance, we try to look what's the implication of, again, the emerging land markets, again, economic vibrancy. So economic vibrancy can be, I mean, again, another way of describing urbanization, level of urbanization. So these are, again, the case of Nigeria, Mozambique, and Ethiopia. What NA represents, that data is not available, but what we see is prevalence of land markets is again uniformly affecting, associated with eroding perceived tenure security in all countries. And the other thing we also try to look is how economic vibrancy or level of urbanization, and similarly urbanization is also associated with higher level of tenure insecurity. And again, I want to remind the audience that here we are not differentiating private tenure risk with public tenure risk. In general, whether it's private or public tenure risk, we try to look at what the driving forces. But in the case of Mozambique, which I will come in a few minutes, we try to disaggregate those sources of tenure security. The other factors that we also try to look at are what are the social dynamics. Social dynamics could be migration, population density, all these kind of variables. And when we look at comparing indigenous, if the respondent is indigenous or whether they are immigrants, what we see is there is a very robust result showing that plot holder, immigrant plot holders, or if the respondent or the household is non-indigenous, that is again positively associated with higher level of tenure insecurity. We also try to compare whether tenure insecurity varies based on the proportion of immigrants, or we can say social homogeneity. And the result shows that in communities with higher proportion of households, whether the head and or the spouse are immigrants, are associated with high level of tenure insecurity. And the last row shows that we see again differentiation comparing whether the plot holder is female or not, and it shows that being when a plot owned, or if the plot holder of the is female, it is highly positively associated with tenure insecurity. The other dynamics or parameters that we also try to look at across those four countries is also to what extent social or political connectedness and legal literacy have implications on perceived tenure security. And this could be again associated with what we consider as the elite capture, to what extent those who are politically or socially connected and the level of perception of tenure security compared to those who are not socially or politically connected. Again, the data in terms of social connectedness is available for Mozambique, and what we see it's positively associated. Social connectedness is associated with enhancing perceived tenure security, and again consistent to the other findings that we are starting to look in various countries. Again, legal literacy, awareness of rules and regulations that govern the land sector is positively associated with higher level of perceived tenure security. So after looking at these different dimensions, what we also try to understand is what is the intra-household dimensions of perceived tenure security, not only comparing female heads with male heads as it is done in many of the household surveys that many studies have been conducting. In Mozambique, we tried to use a very unique data set because I mean, taking advantage of the agricultural household survey in 2015, 2016, we also tried to conduct interviews of rich land tenure modules, not only to the heads or female heads and male heads, but also the spouses of the principal male. And this provides an opportunity to have an understanding of drivers of perceived tenure security, what we call the inter-household analysis, that is comparing the female head with male heads, but also the intra-household dimensions, because again, many of the land right protection programs doesn't seem to take into account the intra-household dimensions, and we would love to share some impressions in terms of what the result shows. And as I defined tenure insecurity, we used two parameters to define tenure insecurity. Collective tenure risk, again, is associated with risk of expropriation or eviction by the private sector, and what we consider as individual tenure risk, that is the type 2 tenure insecurity, takes the value of 1 if the respondent is perceived that it is likely that they will lose ownership or use rights due to private land disputes, inheritance, border, divorce, associated disputes. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that we do not only have female rich data sets on female heads and male heads, we also have the similar responses for the spouse of the principal male, and this provides an opportunity again to have an inter-household and intra-household dimensions of understanding drivers of perceived tenure security. So analysis on using the pooled sample, that is again pulling together the three groups of respondents, the male heads, female heads, and female spouses. First, what we see is being a female head is positively associated with higher likelihood of perceived tenure insecurity, but negatively associated with fear of land loss due to expropriation or eviction by the private sector. And when we try to pull the data and compare the drivers of perceived tenure security, female heads, female spouses with the principal male, and this is because the data only allows us to conduct this type of analysis on the individual tenure risk, that is tenure risk associated with divorce, inheritance, and the like. What we see is, again, being a female head household is more likely to be perceived tenure security due to individual tenure risks, but again, female spouse is negatively associated, and this is in relative to being male-headed household. So again, focusing on, after looking at the intercept effects of private tenure risk and comparing the three groups of, we tried to look at the intercept effects, and as was described in the four comparisons of the 4 country case studies, respondents, again, legal awareness or legal literacy has interesting findings that shows legal literacy is positively associated with enhancing tenure security of, again, the dependent variable is tenure insecurity. So whatever negative option we see in this table is a positive. It has a positive meaning. So tenure insecurity is the dependent variable. So legal literacy is, again, negatively affecting tenure insecurity, indirectly meaning enhancing tenure security. But interestingly, legal literacy or awareness of the rules and regulations that manage the land governance sector is negatively associated with being a male head household. And I don't know what the policy implication for this, whether we should educate our male heads or not, but that's again a very interesting finding that we have seen. And again, these are the three groups. The second column is for female spouse, the third column for male heads, and the last column is for female heads. And being I mean, a younger respondent is again I mean, associated with higher level of tenure insecurity as a female head, but not significantly affecting female spouses or being head. And again, as I mentioned earlier, being indigenous or non-immigrant matters most for female heads as compared to female as a spouse and the male principal male respondents. And as mentioned earlier, we also try to look at what are the differential impacts of the land market vibrancy on these three groups of respondents. And again, a more active land market seems to erode and are likely to erode tenure security of female as a spouse compared to female heads and principal male. And this is very interesting because again, this is where we are trying to show the intra-household dimensions of the market vibrancy and economic vibrancy. The other findings is that again, relative land abundance, community level relative land abundance seems to matter most in enhancing tenure security of female heads, but not significant for female as a spouse and the principal male. And this is again very interesting because again, this is where the customary tenure system comes under more scrutiny in areas where there is a relative land scarcity. The most vulnerable group to be affected in terms of their perceived tenure security are the female heads, and because perhaps again the female spouses feel more secure because they have the protection of the principal male maybe. And again, when we try to look at the mode of land acquisition, whether what type of mode of land acquisition is associated with higher tenure security and for which group, and again the result shows that the rows are a little bit purchased parcels. I mean, parcels acquired through purchase are more likely to show higher level of perceived tenure security for female heads, but inherited parcels seems to be the case for female spouses. And we also tried, again, finally, we tried to look, okay, now we're starting to see that the emerging land markets in Africa are associated, unless we do something, emerging land markets or land market vibrancy seems to erode the protection the customary tenure system used to give to those vulnerable groups and women and the youth. So we try to look at, okay, what do we see? What's the implication of this land market vibrancy in those four country case studies, looking at only proportion of parcels with women landholders? And again, this could be a collective right or a sole landholding right by women. So whether we didn't make any differentiation. And well, interestingly, in those comparing those four countries, the countries that we consider as relatively land scarce countries, these are countries where we see a negative correlation between land market vibrancy and tenure security, because in areas with less vibrant land markets in Ethiopia and Malawi that we see a larger proportion of parcels with women landholders, whereas in areas with vibrant land markets, again, this is the more we commodify the land, the more land becomes, or in areas with active land markets, these are areas that we see women struggling to come as sole or joint landholders. Similarly, the youth, again, we define youth here 15 to 35. So in the surveys, if there is anyone mentioned to have land rights over a given parcel within the age bracket of 15 to 35, we consider this as a demi, and we try to compare proportion of youth landholders in vibrant land markets versus less vibrant land markets, and consistently, like the women land rights, again, Ethiopia and Malawi seems to show that youth struggles in with the protect or land rights in areas where there is vibrant land markets, and again, this could be because of the relative scarcity of land in those areas with vibrant land markets. So overall, as I mean, the findings reinforce the impression that the customer tenure system is under more scrutiny or pressure in areas with commercial land markets, more vibrant land markets, and this implies that interventions should focus again, as the results from the LGAF tool shows that intervention should focus institutional support to the local capacity in maintaining good land governance. And again, the emerging land markets is also showing that perhaps the traditional leaders are prone to acting as land managers instead of custodians of the land in areas where there is emerging land market compared to areas where the traditional agriculture is practiced. And the other thing is maybe when we make all this kind of land in the emerging land markets has also implications what type of negotiations are happening, whether there is information asymmetry and the like. Legal literacy, and again, what we have seen consistently in all the countries, case study countries, whether it is the LGAF results or the case study countries using household surveys, is that legal literacy programs seems to enhance tenure security of households, especially women, both female as a head and spouse, and can be considered as a less costly or sustainable policy measures towards safeguarding land rights. And overall results also imply that land rights registration and documentation programs should, again, we can maximize the outcome of this land registration or land titling programs if we package those programs with legal literacy. And again, this could be in order to avoid what we call as the elite capture situation. And those perhaps, again, the results that shows that in areas with high economic vibrancy and land market vibrancy, these are areas where we see, of course, especially marginalized groups struggling to protect their own land rights. So land registration or documentation of land rights at community level can be deemed sufficient in areas with less commercialized or traditional agriculture. And the issue of sustainability is also very important, because whatever actions, policy actions or interventions being undertaken by governments, unless it is sufficiently resourced through local means and minimize the donor dependence, the continent will remain to again struggle in terms of maintaining the sustainability of these innovative interventions to enhance tenure security. And overall programs which aim to enhance land tenure security should again take into consideration the contextuality and the characteristics of communities and groups of households during the formulation and implementation of the programs. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if yeah,
great.
3
Thanks.
minutes more.
No, that was great. Perfect timing. So before I pose a few questions to Hosanna, let me just remind all your listeners to feel free, and I encourage you actually to submit some questions in the chat. We received a couple, but there's time for many more. I'm going to start maybe with a couple of questions around the land governance assessment framework data that you presented, because we had a couple of questions come in on that. So two that I'll pose, and then maybe it leads to a third one, is that in terms of recognition of rights, it was noted that in terms of recognizing the rights of vulnerable communities, that it seemed that the scores for Ethiopia and Uganda, somebody noticed, were similar, yet their form of tenure systems are quite different in terms of state ownership of land versus not. So they were wondering how two diverse countries like that could wind up with the same score on a recognition of rights, given that certain rights are restricted in Ethiopia. The other thing, another just related, was noting that on informal payments, it was noted again that in Ethiopia they it was received an A grade on not on kind of clamping down on informal payments. But a person wrote that they weren't quite sure if that could be trusted, that result, in case of Ethiopia. So I think that leads to generally, you could maybe comment on that one in particular, but just maybe a general question is, how reliable are some of these results, and are they updated periodically? How often are they updated, and are new, or maybe say improved methods being used in the LGAP as time goes on? So maybe you can reflect on those questions.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, as you rightly mentioned, um, so as I mentioned earlier, actually my first task after I joined IFPRI was to work with the World Bank team implementing the land governance assessment framework, and they could be better positioned to answer these questions. But this methodology or the tool is based on available secondary data. I mean, again, so it's, and again also expert opinion. And the issue that was raised, at least I know 5, 6, 7 years ago, is unless this is updated periodically, what we will see is a kind of an issue. But what is innovative about the land governance assessment framework is it is not like say someone from IFPRI or someone from Europe or the US telling these countries, I mean, labeling countries, so you're doing bad or good, but it is kind of the citizens of these countries engaging their government, communicating these results. But again, there was an attempt by the World Bank team to update this periodically, also inform the monitoring and evaluation programs. So I think but what's interesting is most of these studies, the land governance assessment framework studies, have been conducted for the last 8, 9 years. So again, that also provides the comparability of the studies. But as you rightly mentioned, it is quite. They provide the opportunity again to ask more. I think they may not be considered as sufficient independently, but again, the LGAP studies has been again the basis, a good foundation for further studies, and the updating is quite very interesting issue, because again, I mean, the last 8, 9, 10 years, many of these countries have gone through a lot of land governance, I mean, for actions, policy actions, and interventions to improve land governance. But I think maybe I should have mentioned which year the studies were conducted, but it is sufficient to mention that these are within 8 to 9 years period. In 2011, at least I know, because the IFPRI World Bank joint project, many of these countries after 2011, Nigeria, Ghana, and I know some of these countries have already updated, because Ethiopia was one of the pilot before 2010, but recently also Ethiopia updated the land governance assessment framework study recently. So there is also ongoing updating of this indicator.
So maybe one more question on this global perspective before maybe I think some other questions are coming in on your other micro studies, but on the LGAP, so it was quite obvious that countries were a bit more advanced on the policy side of things, of the recognition, and a little bit more behind on the implementation and service delivery. And I'm quite aware that at the stage of policy development, there was a lot of good collective action on the continent of Africa of people sharing experiences for good policy formulation. Is that still continuing today in terms of implementation issues and service delivery? Are there mechanisms where countries can share their experiences with others?
So again, this is very interesting, because this also is related to what the pilot project, IFPRI, the Africa Land Policy Center, and the monitoring and evaluation of land governance also is a good opportunity to maintain the South-South learning in terms of the formulation and implementation. And not only at the continental level, even at the REC level. For instance, I know of the IGAD land governance unit trying again to maintain the South-South learning in terms of the formulation and implementation. So as an observer, signs are very encouraging, at least because what was deemed as best practice in different countries the replicability, without taking into account the replicability of these best practices. You may see some countries trying to copy paste whatever first sign of success is shown in one country, but again, because of the context that I mentioned, the contextuality, unless you take those into account and understand, or simply documenting what is working best where, doesn't guarantee you the replicability. So with this, again, unique data sets, what many researchers, and including researchers from IFPRI, trying to do is the why. Unless we understand why those interventions or policy actions are working in given countries, without understanding the why, you are always risking the replicability, and that we may prepare ourselves for a disappointment unless we go one step further and understand the what works where and the why. I think that's
good. Okay, I will move on now to some more. Maybe just can you mentioned that the measurement of tenure insecurity is the perception of or fear of losing land. Can that be asked in the same way in the different countries? Say the case of Ethiopia, where you don't have ownership rights anyway. Is it perceived similarly as other countries? And then I guess more generally, is there other ways to capture tenure insecurity besides that question? And did you explore other measures, for example?
At least in the countries where my personal research interest has mainly focused, the case of Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Mozambique, one thing that we try to disaggregate is at least just you feel secure about your land rights may not be enough to ask, because unless, so the reason why we feel like the disaggregation is very necessary is because the very policy actions that help you enhance tenure security depends on what caused the tenure insecurity, right? And again, if you look at the package of policy and administrative reforms that can enhance tenure security, that includes again the legal literacy. Simply, that could be the less costly way of enhancing tenure security could be legal awareness, making the people aware of the rules and regulations that govern the land governance sector. There could be, if even when you look at the land registration, land titling at household level, land titling at parcel level, or land titling at community level. And this, without understanding what caused the tenure insecurity, what level of titling or what level of documentation of land rights could be deemed sufficient. And again, the result shows that in areas where there is less commercial agriculture, or in areas with less vibrant land markets, perhaps land right documentation at the community level could be a very good starting point, right? So the reason for the need to disaggregate the sources of tenure security without simply asking, or do you feel losing, and again, the questions are not framed in a way, and this is again the World Bank team, the LSMS team has done a very good job in terms of updating the way those questions should be asked, is that the questions are not like, do you feel losing your land ownership? What makes the results to be comparable across countries is fear losing the rights you have over the land. So that could be ownership in some countries, that could be land use rights in another countries. But again, is it more as related to collective tenure risk, that is eviction by private investor or expropriation by the government? So again, the way the questions should be framed, maybe I also recommend for the audience to have a look at the modules of the LSMS data collection. They have done a very good job recently in again keep updating and framing those questions, and the way we ask them really matters, not only for understanding but also maintaining the comparability of the studies across countries.
Right. Okay, so now I'm going to bring you down to a couple of the specific findings that you have. So there was one question came in about in the case of Mozambique, for example, where you were able to differentiate between men and women. There was we know that in Africa quite a few women tend to outlive males, and they become, they become widows over land. So the question was whether you're able to differentiate and distinguish widows from other females who are the sole owners of plots, for example, and whether that had a distinction about whether a woman was a widow or not, in terms of their perceived tenure and security.
Yeah, very interesting. Uh, so at least the Mozambique data has done a very good job in pushing the analysis, in pushing the discussion to a different level by at least not grouping female as as a homogeneous group, right?
Yeah.
Because what we did in the case of Mozambique is female as a spouse versus female as a head.
Yeah.
But I think what makes this question interesting is, okay, how about again another level of disaggregation? Focus disaggregating the females as a head. It is very doable because we have the characteristics of the female heads. Of course, there is a risk of again losing the degree of freedom,
Right.
because we are going to again disaggregate the as showed, because we only have like 928 928 female heads in Mozambique, and the question seems to, okay, can we have another level of disaggregation focusing on those 928 households? At least we can have a go with a descriptive kind of characterization of like female is because they could be heads through divorce, or being widow, or even single female and yet to be married, all these kind of things. And I think it's very interesting. Maybe that's food for thought.
Okay. So just a related question came in on Malawi, because it was observed that in Malawi you have matrilineal, patrilineal, matrilocal, all sorts of different types of customary inheritance practices. So, and then you had mentioned that you really hadn't dug in the data too much in Malawi, but is that going to be an important distinction? And did that distinction come up in some of your other countries?
Yeah, I think so. What makes Malawi, to the best of my knowledge, Malawi is one of the countries with, at the higher level in terms of the data demand for gender disaggregated land rights, understanding of the analysis of land rights. And again, colleagues from the World Bank have done a very good job recently. There are recent studies in trying to again disaggregate and have more understanding of the patrilineal and matrilineal sources. But yeah, from IFPRI side, mainly because the data just became available the last year or so. And again, we felt like the World Bank team has been doing a good job in conducting this type of analysis. But I think that's very interesting. Maybe based on the IFPRI database, Nigeria could be one country where we can do again one step further in trying to disaggregate, comparing communities based on the land tenure systems. But in the case of Mozambique, Malawi, like I said, that is I don't have the studies on the top of my head, but Klaus and his team has been doing a good job in very unique data set, I should say, in Malawi using the LSMS module, land tenure module.
Okay, good. So another question came in about so you presented results at the country level, which is obviously the best way to do this in a seminar and a webinar, but there's going to be just differences within a country, obviously. So one question came in, have you looked at kind of within country heterogeneity of the insecurities, and I know that you do some controls for some community level variables and so forth in your results, but is there a sense, do you have a sense that there's a lot of variation? So like if you have an average for Malawi or Nigeria or something, is there a lot of variation within the country? That's question one. And then a second related question was, do you think that the size of the country might influence the results, in the sense of maybe it's easier to govern a small country like Rwanda than a larger country, and could that actually help, could that influence the findings that you do with the LGAP or your own?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the conclusions from these studies is that not only across countries, but even within countries, context matters, right? I mean, take Ethiopia. You cannot really come up with one policy prescription that will help you address the land governance issues in the country. The lowlands, the highlands, highly densely populated areas, uh, sparsely populated areas, even in terms of like areas with land active land markets versus areas less active land markets. Even I mean, again, I'm showing the two slides, those two slides in terms of how land market vibrancy is affecting within countries. We see again starking evidence showing that, for instance, female land ownership or land holding rights of female uh, significantly varies within countries, especially Mozambique, Malawi and Ethiopia, that it is in areas where there is less active land markets that you see larger proportion of females. So there are again interesting findings even within countries showing even the in-depth analysis. The last few tables that I have presented shows even the difference in terms of the source, not only the source of tenure insecurity, but even by different groups that we see the economic vibrancy, social and economic dynamics that I have tried to explain matters. And the last question was like, okay, so can we confidently say that maybe being small is beautiful? Maybe in the case, and again, if we say context matters for coming up with the right policy and tools to enhance tenure security, I mean, you're running a lower risk of being compromised by the context if the country is small, right? Because the within country variation. So this is just my personal observation that maybe that's also one thing that the continent has gone a little bit further is now there is a huge appetite for understanding the why, right? Before it was like, okay, let's countries were scrambling for signs of innovations, best practices, and copy pasting. Take for instance, if Nigeria is duplicating what Rwanda has been praised for the systematic land tenure regularization program, definitely there is only one outcome coming out of that, because you cannot even I mean, the very two countries with contrasting contexts. So yeah, I would say, I mean, again, yeah, the like other public service deliveries, land governance service delivery really matters because we need to take context into account. And I would say, yeah, being small could have some, but that doesn't guarantee you success. That the smaller you are, that doesn't mean that you could be. Yeah.
So maybe just a question just came in that's related to our discussion, so I'll pose this before I move on to a couple others. But it was noted it came in that in Nigeria, land ownership is vested in the governor of the state, and so there's diversity. Again, this comes up to the diversity. So are you able to kind of characterize that diversity at state level in Nigeria with the samples that you have?
Maybe that's also something I missed mentioning earlier. The data used for the Nigeria analysis is from one state.
Okay.
Again, yeah, I mean uh, so the sample size versus the quality of the data. That was the compromise that we had to make in Nigeria. In the case of Nigeria, we used data from Southwest Nigeria, I guess, Ondo State. So that didn't give us the opportunity to look at the various contexts within the country. I know the 2012-2013 LSMS data has a little bit rich land tenure questions. So perhaps that could also be of an interest for the audience to have a go in terms of again disaggregating it. But the analysis we use is from a particular state.
Good. Yeah. So one question was, to what extent are all these results published? And what we can say anyway is that we can follow up with people who have registered to send them a list of your publications. So we'll do that. But do you want to give a general overview of where you are in terms of publication of these results?
Yeah, the Ghana paper is already published in land use policy. Ethiopia study is on the pipeline, but many of the studies were conducted the last 2 years, and they are IFPRI publications, at least IFPRI discussion papers. Yeah, so it is.
Okay.
We can share.
So we'll share the titles with everyone after this. So now let's turn over in our last few minutes to policy implications. We touched on it in a couple of questions, but generally, how have you yourself been trying to engage in policy processes in some of the countries that you've been working? And has there been already some uptake from some of these studies or some of your previous work that were before? So what's the level of, let's say, the appetite for evidence-based policy reforms in this area, and how we can help?
Okay, so again, talking from my own personal experience, the learning curve has been very steep. Because personally, what I have experienced is that the more you involve the relevant governments and donors, because whatever we do, we're not only trying to inform policymakers, right? The donor group is also our target, because as I mentioned earlier, in Africa, there is a huge reliance on donor resources to fund these whatever innovative land governance programs or policy actions. So the more you involve those stakeholders, the donors and the government policymakers from the inception of the research, the higher the likelihood of the uptake of the research. So currently, we do work with government stakeholders in at least all the at least the three countries: Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Mozambique. And those countries are still ongoing mega projects to enhance tenure security, be it land registration, community level land registration, individual level land registration programs in Mozambique, the second stage land certification program in Ethiopia. So we are either at ministerial level or at directorate level, we try to involve. And one way of, again, doing this is we take advantage of national policy dialogues or seminars or conferences, again, joint sessions, organizing joint sessions with this. And for instance, in the case of Ethiopia, we're trying to at least inform ongoing policy actions, working closely with the different land investment for transformation, the LIFT program, but at the same time also with the directorate under the Ministry of Agriculture to inform the ongoing mega project or second stage land certification program in Mozambique, more or less the same. But these are at national level, but also we try to zoom out and also try to engage at continental and regional level. And I should say our engagement through the monitoring and evaluation of land governance with the Africa Land Policy Center, when they have different strategy, framework, documentations, we try to inform some of the directions or the strategies being developed based on the findings from the pilot or case study countries. And there is now new opportunity also even to work closely with the ICAD land governance unit, and that will provide the much needed opportunity again to engage to be engaged in the policy dialogue. So not only at national level, we also try to rely on this continental and regional platforms for again to make use of the research findings, inform policy actions and directions. Yeah.
Maybe just coming to a couple of specific examples. So you've noted that actually the emergence of land markets can create insecurity for some vulnerable groups. And I guess in your countries that you're studying, like in the case of Ethiopia, maybe only rental tenancy kinds of markets, but in other countries it could be sales and a mix of different markets. But is there any government or upon your own reflection, are there any ways to make markets to be more beneficial for the vulnerable, because we do realize that they're based, say, on income and wealth and and so forth, and so there's an advantage for the wealthy and the elite. But how are there countries that have taken some steps to reduce vulnerability?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question because, again, it reminds me of something that I should have mentioned as a caveat when I was presenting the results. Those findings that I have presented does not necessarily mean to say land markets are bad for the poor or the youth or women. The results are saying the status quo land administration system, which is most in many of these countries, the customary tenure system seems to struggle more in protecting land rights of women, youth, and other vulnerable groups in areas where land markets are active. This doesn't necessarily mean land markets are bad for this, but unless you do something, they are going to again uh, favor those marginalized groups. So it's more scrutiny on the status quo land administration system. But would there be cases that that I may have seen from the various studies where land markets may help even enhance land access or tenure security of those vulnerable groups? I think one country that I can mention is in the case of Ethiopia. That the study we conducted with other IFPRI colleagues in Ethiopia in terms of like how land access or land inheritance affects livelihood decisions of the youth is not only inheritance, likelihood of inheriting land is a dictating factor in migration and non-agricultural employment of the youth. We also try to zoom in and try to look, okay, how does the role of land inheritance affect youth's decision comparing in areas where land markets are active versus areas land markets are less active. And the results in Ethiopia seems to show that actually active land markets helps youth make an economical decision or a very merited decision whether to migrate or not, because it is in those areas where land markets are active that you see family-based land access not to matter most, because even in Ethiopia, where if the youth has access to land through the temporary means, that is land rental market, because land cannot be sold or bought in Ethiopia, even in areas with access to land through the temporary means, that's the land rental market, you don't see that land inheritance is a defining factor whether they should migrate or not. That means they can also rely on the temporary means of land access and avoid unrewarding migration or non-agricultural employment. And this actually, one thing I didn't mention is this was a very relevant policy dimension in Ethiopia because the government has been imposing restrictions on the functionality of land markets to protect those vulnerable groups. But actually, the outcome was the opposite because it is because of inactive land markets that we see out migration of the youth and scrambling for employment in the non-agricultural sector.
And do these programs like certification program in Ethiopia or this documentation in a statutory the duat holder in Mozambique, for example, does that affect then the perception of insecurity at all?
Again, the presentation I had doesn't show the impact of land titling or land certification, but in the case of Ethiopia, the data set that we has been collecting since 2013, 2014 is providing a very unique opportunity, at least for us to say, because in Ethiopia there was a low cost first aid land certification program with less clarity on the boundaries, which was showing a robust positive impact on household investment, land market participation and stuff. Now that's also there are ongoing studies to understand the impact of the second level land certification program, and over the course of the next few months or mid 2020 we'll have findings. Similarly, in Mozambique, we are trying to work with Maza, Minister of Agriculture, to look at not only the DUAT, individual level DUATs, but also collective, what are the impacts of collective land right protection and individual land right protection. And we're trying to use household surveys and special data sets to really have the differential impacts of this. And again, yeah.
Great.
more results would come.
Yeah. Okay, good. So hopefully that'll keep our listeners satisfied. So stay tuned anyway. But no, I think I want to thank Hosanna very much for this great webinar. So, I mean, I think the key lessons are really that this is a very complex topic. We all know that. And there's no one size fits all. It's very context specific. And he's only also given, one, as you could tell from the last responses, only a little bit about what he's working on has been covered today about the perceptions of tenure and security. He is working on the impacts of different tenure reforms, including these legal instruments, not only in terms of how that shifts security perceptions, but encourages investment and other kinds of benefits and may reduce land markets and so forth. So there's a lot of important things that we're undertaking within the PIM program, and we'll, given all that, I think we have to sign up for another webinar from you next year. So thanks to everyone, and remember you can look at the webinar again online at pim.cgir.org. So thanks everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you.